You know what I love about contractors? Commander Blake Harris's voice cut through the lunch rush at Norfolk's dining facility like a blade through silk. 42 officers and enlisted personnel lined the buffet, trays in hand, conversations humming. The smell of grilled chicken and steam table vegetables hung thick in the air under fluorescent lights that made everything look slightly washed out, slightly too bright. Harris leaned against the beverage station, arms crossed, watching Nina Cade move behind the serving line with the efficiency of someone who'd done this 1,000 times. His smile didn't reach his eyes. "They're disposable," he continued, loud enough for the people around him to hear. Lieutenant Vance, standing beside him with a tray of food, laughed it on cue. No accountability, no standards, just warm bodies filling gaps we're too important to fill ourselves. Nina didn't look up. She placed a scoop of mashed potatoes onto the next plate with measured precision, her movements economical in a way that spoke of discipline rather than routine. Brown hair pulled back tight, gray contractor polo tucked in, black non-slip shoes that had seen better days but were spotlessly clean. The line moved forward. Harris pushed off the beverage station and walked parallel to the serving counter, tracking her like a hunter watching prey that hadn't yet realized it was being hunted. 11:30 a.m. on a Tuesday meant peak traffic, which meant maximum audience, which was exactly what he wanted. Nina reached for the next tray. Harris stepped directly into her path. The collision was deliberate. His shoulder drove into her forearm with enough force to send the tray spinning. Soup, salad, a bread roll, and a glass of iced tea launched into the air in a spray of liquid and ceramic. The crash echoed across the dining facility like a gunshot. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads turned. 42 people became an audience in the space of a heartbeat. The soup splattered across the tile floor in a star pattern. Lettuce scattered like green confetti. The glass shattered, sending ice cubes skittering under the steam tables. Nina stood frozen, tray still extended, eyes fixed on the mess spreading toward the boots of a master chief who'd been reaching for silverware. Harris stepped back, hands raised in mock innocence, his face arranged into an expression of exaggerated concern that didn't match the satisfaction in his eyes. "Wow," he said loudly. "Guess contractors can't even hold a tray." He let the words hang for a beat, then gestured downward with one hand. "On your knees, clean it." The silence stretched. Someone's fork clinked against a plate. The ventilation system hummed. Nina set the tray down on the counter with careful precision, then reached under the serving station for cleaning supplies. Her face showed nothing, an empty canvas that gave Harris no satisfaction and the watching crowd no clue what she was thinking. She knelt. Not quickly, not slowly, just knelt, like someone following a procedure written in muscle memory. Her right hand found a sanitized cloth. Her left braced against the floor. And then something small happened, something most people wouldn't notice. Her breathing changed. Not panicked, not angry, just 4 counts in through the nose. Hold for 4, 4 counts out through the mouth, hold for 4. The rhythm was so precise it looked practiced, drilled, automatic. Her shoulders rose and fell with mechanical regularity, even as soup soaked into the knees of her work pants. Chief Petty Officer Ray Kellerman, 52 years old, with the weathered face of someone who had done 2 decades before retiring and coming back as civilian kitchen staff, stood 3 feet away refilling napkin dispensers. He watched Nina's breathing pattern. His hands stopped moving. His eyes narrowed just slightly, the way someone looks at a puzzle piece that doesn't fit where it's supposed to, but fits somewhere important. Nina wiped the floor in smooth arcs, gathering soup and lettuce and glass fragments into a pile. Her wrist rotated as she wrung out the cloth, and for just a second, the motion looked wrong. Not clumsy wrong. Wrong like someone who'd learned to break a zip tie restraint and couldn't quite unlearn the muscle memory. The twist was too controlled, too specific, ending at an angle that would maximize leverage against a binding rather than simply clean a floor. Kellerman's hands stayed frozen on the napkin dispenser. His breathing changed too, just for a moment, faster, sharper. Then he forced it back to normal and went back to refilling napkins like he hadn't seen anything at all. Harris stood over Nina, hands on his hips, playing to the crowd. "Take your time," he said. "I know attention to detail isn't really a contractor's strength, but do try to get all the glass. We wouldn't want anyone getting hurt because you couldn't do your job right." A few people laughed, nervous laughter, the kind that comes from not knowing what else to do. Most just watched, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. This was a commander talking to a contractor. Chain of command was chain of command. Nina gathered the last of the glass, deposited everything into a waste bin, then stood. Still no expression, still no words. She walked to the hand-washing station, scrubbed her hands for exactly 20 seconds, dried them, then returned to her position behind the serving line as if nothing had happened. The wet patches on her knees were already starting to darken the gray fabric. The line resumed. People took their food. Conversations restarted, quieter now, careful not to look directly at Nina or Harris. The moment passed, absorbed into the background noise of a military dining facility at lunch rush. But the camera mounted in the corner, the one that covered the serving line for food safety compliance, had captured everything. And later, when Nina was alone in the dry storage room, taking inventory at 3:45 p.m., she'd review that footage on her personal tablet with the kind of focus usually reserved for intelligence analysis. Frame by frame, angle by angle, cataloging who'd laughed, who'd looked away, who'd seemed uncomfortable but stayed silent, building evidence, layer by careful layer. For now, she just served food, scooped potatoes, ladled soup into fresh bowls, smiled politely when someone said thank you. At one point, Chief Kellerman came through the line. He didn't make eye contact, but he left a folded piece of paper next to the bread basket when he reached for rolls. Nina palmed it without looking, tucked it into her pocket, and kept working. The lunch rush wound down. By 1:15 p.m., the crowd had thinned to stragglers and people on late breaks. Nina finished her shift, clocked out, and walked to the small office space contractors shared near the loading dock. Concrete walls painted institutional beige, metal desk with a failing drawer slide, one window looking out over the parking lot where seagulls fought over discarded French fries. She locked the door behind her, sat at the desk, and unfolded Kellerman's note. I know what 4-count breathing means. I won't ask. But watch Harris. Nina read it twice, then fed it into the paper shredder beside the desk. The machine hummed, reducing the warning to confetti. She pulled off the bandage wrapped around her right wrist, supposedly covering a cooking burn. Underneath, a thin strip of black ink was visible along her inner forearm, just below where the sleeve ended. Not enough to identify, just enough to remind her why she was here. She wrapped the bandage back carefully, smoothing the edges, then opened her laptop. The screen showed a grid of security camera angles, legitimate feeds she had access to as part of food safety protocols. She opened a second window, this one showing a different grid, cameras Harris didn't know existed because they were hers, hidden in air vents and behind ceiling tiles, installed during her first week, when everyone assumed she was just another contractor learning the layout. 3:45 p.m. She had inventory to finish before the dinner prep started, but first, she needed to understand something. If you've ever been underestimated because of what you do instead of who you are, hit that like button and subscribe, because this story is just beginning. Nina's silence isn't weakness, it's strategy, and Commander Harris is about to learn the difference. The walk-in refrigerator at Norfolk's DFS was a cathedral of stainless steel and commercial refrigeration, 15 feet by 20, walls lined with wire shelving, holding industrial containers of lettuce, dairy, and protein. Temperature logs hung on a clipboard by the door, requiring checks every 4 hours. Most contractors scribbled numbers based on the digital display by the entrance. Nina used a handheld infrared thermometer, taking readings from 6 different points throughout the space, recording them in a leather notebook that looked more like a detective's casebook than a food safety log. She swept the laser across a pallet of chicken breast, frowned at the reading, then checked the temperature again from a different angle. 38.2 degrees Fahrenheit, well within the safety zone of 32 to 40. But yesterday at the same time, the same pallet had read 36.8. A degree and a half warmer wasn't dangerous, but it was inconsistent, and inconsistency meant something had changed. Nina photographed the pallet from 3 angles, making sure the thermometer display was visible in each shot. Then she crouched, examining the floor around the pallet base. No water, no ice buildup, no signs the pallet had been moved. She stood, checked the ceiling-mounted cooling unit, and found what she was looking for. One of the louvers was bent, redirecting airflow away from this section. Could have been an accident, could have been maintenance, could have been deliberate. She made a note, finished the temperature sweep, and exited the cooler. The kitchen was in the dead zone between lunch cleanup and dinner prep, just 2 cooks prepping vegetables and 1 dishwasher running sanitizer cycles. Kellerman was in the office doing paperwork. Nina walked past without stopping, heading for the dry storage room, where she was supposed to be conducting inventory anyway. 50-pound bags of rice stacked on pallets, industrial cans of tomato sauce, boxes of pasta, in quantities measured by the thousand. She worked methodically, checking quantities against the digital inventory system, making notes when numbers didn't match. 20 minutes in, she found the first discrepancy. The system said they had 18 cases of olive oil, but physical count showed 15. 3 cases, 48 bottles, roughly $600 retail value. Could have been a data entry error, could have been shrinkage, could have been theft. Nina photographed the shelves, updated her personal inventory spreadsheet, and kept working. The pattern continued. Shortfalls in olive oil, premium cuts of steak, imported cheese, all high-value items that wouldn't be missed immediately, but would add up over time. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would trigger automatic alerts, just steady bleeding that looked like normal loss if you didn't know where to look. She checked her watch. 4:32 p.m. Dinner service started at 5. She had 28 minutes before she needed to be back on the serving line. She locked the storage room, walked to the loading dock, and made a phone call on her personal cell. The number connected after 2 rings. No greeting, just silence waiting to be filled. Nina spoke quietly, her voice flat and professional. Pattern confirmed, high-value inventory shrinkage consistent with systematic diversion, estimate 12 to 15,000 monthly, requesting authorization to escalate surveillance. Granted, a man's voice said. Older, measured, the kind of voice that had given orders in rooms where mistakes cost lives. Time frame? 72 hours. I need to confirm the distribution chain. You have 60. After that, the window closes. The line went dead. Nina pocketed the phone, returned to the kitchen, and started prep for dinner service like she'd never left. Kellerman glanced at her once when she came back in, but said nothing. He'd been in long enough to recognize when someone was running an operation, even if he didn't know what kind. The dinner rush started at 5:03 p.m. with a wave of enlisted personnel coming off shift. Nina took her position behind the serving line. Same gray polo, same efficient movements, same invisible presence that let people look through her instead of at her. She served meatloaf, green beans, mashed potatoes with gravy, smiled when appropriate, stayed silent otherwise. At 5:47 p.m., Commander Harris came through the line. He didn't cause a scene this time, just took his tray with a smirk that said he didn't need to. Yesterday's humiliation was already established. Now he could just enjoy the lingering power dynamic without additional effort. Nina served his food. Their eyes met for exactly 1 second. His were confident, amused, secure in his position. Hers were empty, showing nothing, promising nothing, revealing nothing. It bothered him, she could tell. People were supposed to react. Anger, fear, resentment, something. The absence of response was a failure of his dominance, a gap in the satisfaction he'd earned. He moved on. The line continued. At 6:15 p.m., Lieutenant Vance came through, Harris's logistics officer and apparent friend. Younger, mid-30s, with the kind of smile that looked friendly until you noticed it never reached his eyes. He paused at the serving station, looking at Nina with exaggerated concern. "Hey, you doing okay after yesterday?" he asked, loud enough for nearby people to hear. "That was pretty rough. I felt bad for you." The tone was sympathetic. The subtext was mockery. "Look how gracious I am, acknowledging your humiliation." Nina nodded once. "I'm fine, sir. Thank you." Her voice was quiet, respectful, completely neutral. Vance waited for more, didn't get it, then moved him on with his tray. 2 people behind him in line, a female petty officer Nina had seen before, made eye contact and gave a tiny, sympathetic smile. Nina acknowledged it with the smallest nod, then returned to serving. Small kindnesses and bureaucratic cruelty. She cataloged those too. At 7:08 p.m., after the dinner rush had faded, Kellerman found her in the dish room, where she was supposed to be helping with cleanup. He dried his hands on a towel, glanced around to make sure they were relatively alone, then spoke quietly. "You're not really a contractor, are you?" Nina continued scraping food waste into the disposal. "My contract is legitimate. I have the paperwork if you need to see it." "That's not what I asked." She looked at him directly for the first time. His face showed experience, caution, and something else. Recognition, maybe, or respect for someone running their own operation in hostile territory. "I do my job," Nina said simply. What I did before doesn't matter. Kellerman considered that, then nodded. Harris is dirty. I've suspected for 6 months, but couldn't prove anything. If you're here to fix that, you should know he's got coverage. Vance handles the logistics. Petty Officer Drummond in supply does the physical work. And they've got someone higher up running interference because 2 people have tried to report discrepancies and both got transferred within a week. Nina stopped scraping plates. Why are you telling me this? Because I saw how you breathe when you're under pressure. 4-count tactical breathing. I used that in Kandahar when we were pinned down for 6 hours. And I saw how you twisted that rag. I've seen that move exactly once. In a resistance training course when an instructor demonstrated breaking flex cuffs. He paused. You're not here to serve food, you're here to hunt. And I spent 20 years in the Navy hunting bad guys. So, I know one when I see one. The dish room was loud with running water and clattering plates. Private enough for dangerous truths. I can't involve you, Nina said quietly. If you're right about higher-up coverage, anyone who helps me becomes a target. I'm 52, and I've got a civilian pension. I'm the safest ally you've got. Kellerman pulled out his phone, typed something, then showed her the screen. A message thread with time-stamped photos of Vance and Drummond moving boxes after hours. I've been documenting. I just didn't know who to trust with it. Nina looked at the photos, then at Kellerman. Calculated risk, potential asset, possible trap. She made the decision in 3 seconds. Send those to yourself from a personal email, then delete them from your phone. Don't access them on base. If I need them, I'll ask. Until then, you don't know me, and I don't know you. Kellerman nodded, already deleting the message thread. One more thing. Harris is planning something for tomorrow. I heard him and Vance talking. Something about an audit. They sounded too happy about it. Nina filed that information, compartmentalized it, and went back to scraping plates. Kellerman left. The dish room continued its industrial rhythm. At 8:30 p.m., she clocked out, walked to her car in the contractor lot, and drove exactly 17 minutes to a nondescript apartment complex 3 miles from base. The apartment was furnished like a stage set, enough personal items to look lived in, nothing that couldn't be abandoned in under 5 minutes. She locked the door, swept for listening devices out of habit, then opened her laptop at the kitchen table. 2 screens. Left screen showed the hidden camera feeds she'd installed. Right screen showed her case file, encrypted 6 ways from Sunday, detailing 3 months of investigation that had started in Washington with a pattern recognition algorithm, flagging Norfolk's supply chain for anomalies, and led to her getting hired as a contractor to investigate from inside. She reviewed the day's footage. Harris humiliating her. Vance's fake sympathy. Kellerman's warning. The temperature discrepancy in the cooler. The inventory shortfalls. Piece by piece, the picture was getting clearer, but it wasn't complete. She needed the distribution network. She needed to know where the stolen goods were going. She needed the higher-up Kellerman had mentioned. Most of all, she needed Harris to feel confident enough to make a mistake. Her phone buzzed. Text from an unknown number. Audit scheduled 0800 tomorrow. Random selection. You were chosen. Have your records ready. Nina read the message 3 times. Random selection, right. She'd been on base for 3 weeks, and this was the first audit, coming 1 day after the public humiliation. From a procedure that usually gave contractors 48 hours notice. This wasn't an audit. This was an execution dressed in bureaucratic clothing. She typed a response. Understood. I'll have everything ready. Then she opened her backup camera footage and started building her defense. If Harris wanted to play auditor, she'd give him an audit. Every temperature reading, every inventory count, every receipt, log, and timestamp, organized with the kind of precision that made accountants weep with joy. But she'd also give him enough rope to hang himself. At 10:42 p.m., she finally closed the laptop, set an alarm for 4:30 a.m., and went to bed. Not to sleep, not really. Sleep was a luxury she'd unlearned in Yemen, when sleeping meant missing the sound of movement outside your position. Instead, she lay in the dark, breathing in counts of 4, mentally rehearsing scenarios for the morning. Harris expected her to be nervous, unprepared, easy to dismantle. He expected a contractor who kept sloppy records and would fold under official scrutiny. He expected someone who didn't know the game. What he'd get was something else entirely. 4:30 a.m. came fast. Nina showered, dressed in her usual contractor uniform, and was on base by 5:45 a.m. The kitchen was dark except for emergency lighting. She used her access card to enter, walked to the office, and started laying out documentation. 3 ring binders, printed spreadsheets, handwritten logs cross-referenced with digital records, photos of every inventory check, temperature charts going back 3 weeks. By 7:30 a.m., the desk looked like the headquarters of someone who took food safety regulations as seriously as a criminal prosecution, because that's exactly what this was. At 7:58 a.m., Harris arrived with an entourage, Vance, Drummond, and a civilian woman Nina recognized as a contract compliance officer from Naval Facilities Engineering Command. Harris smiled when he saw the documentation spread across the desk. "Wow," he said. "Someone's been busy, or nervous. Hard to tell which." The compliance officer, a woman named Patricia Chen with 20 years of experience detecting contractor fraud, ignored Harris and focused on Nina. "Miss Cade, this is a random audit of your food safety practices and inventory management. We'll need to review your documentation and conduct a physical inspection of storage areas. This should take approximately 2 hours. Do you have any questions?" Nina shook her head. "No, ma'am. Everything's ready." Chen nodded and started with the temperature logs. Nina handed them over, watching Chen's expression shift from routine inspection to genuine interest as she paged through 3 weeks of meticulous readings, complete with photos and cross-references to maintenance records. "You take 6-point readings?" Chen asked. "Yes, ma'am. The regulation requires monitoring, but it doesn't specify methodology. I prefer thoroughness." Harris leaned against the wall, arms crossed, waiting for the mistake that would justify whatever he'd planned. Chen continued through inventory logs, food rotation schedules, cleaning protocols, and receiving documentation. Each section was more detailed than the last, complete with timestamps, witness signatures when applicable, and notes explaining any deviations from standard procedure. 40 minutes in, Chen looked up from the paperwork. "This is some of the most comprehensive documentation I've seen from a contract food service provider. Most contractors do the bare minimum. You've exceeded every requirement by a significant margin." Harris's smile faltered slightly. "What about discrepancies? Surely there must be something that doesn't add up." Chen flipped back through the inventory logs. "Actually, Miss Cade has documented several discrepancies. Olive oil, premium beef, imported cheese, all flagged with notes indicating when the variance was discovered and suggestions for investigation." She looked at Harris. "Did you follow up on these reports, Commander?" The room temperature seemed to drop 5 degrees. Harris straightened from the wall. "I wasn't aware she'd filed reports. Those should have come through my office." Nina reached into the bottom desk drawer and pulled out a manila folder. "They did, sir. I submitted them through the online system. These are the confirmation receipts with timestamps." She handed the folder to Chen. Chen opened it, scanned the contents, then looked at Harris with an expression that had shifted from neutral to suspicious. "These are dated over the past 2 weeks, all properly submitted, all marked as received by your office, none marked as reviewed or resolved. Do you think Commander Harris made a mistake, or is something bigger going on? Drop your prediction in the comments below, and smash that thanks button if you want to see Nina prove everyone wrong." Vance stepped forward, his voice smooth and helpful. "Could be a system glitch. The online reporting tool has been having issues lately. I can look into it." "Please do," Chen said, but her tone suggested she wasn't buying it. She turned back to Nina. "Let's do the physical inspection. Commander Harris, you're welcome to accompany us." They walked to the storage areas, dry goods first, then refrigeration. Nina led them through each space, pointing out organization systems, rotation protocols, and sanitation schedules. Everything was military precise, which made sense for someone with a military background, but looked excessive for a contractor. In the walk-in cooler, Chen stopped at the pallet Nina had been concerned about yesterday. "What's the current temperature reading for this section?" Nina pulled out her infrared thermometer and took 3 readings: 38.6, 38.4, and 38.7 degrees, slightly higher than yesterday's readings, which were averaging 37 degrees. "I documented a bent louver yesterday that might be affecting airflow." Chen examined the louver, took her own reading with a facility thermometer, and made notes. "I'll have maintenance check this today. Good catch." Harris watched this exchange with growing frustration. This wasn't going the way he'd planned. The audit was supposed to find problems, create justification for termination, or at least a formal reprimand that would undermine Nina's credibility. Instead, Chen was finding exemplary practices that made Harris's oversight look inadequate by comparison. They finished the physical inspection. Chen made a few more notes, then they returned to the office for her to complete her report. Harris and Vance stood to one side, communicating in the silent language of people whose plan was falling apart. Drummond had disappeared entirely, probably warned off by Vance. Chen typed on her laptop for several minutes, then turned the screen toward Nina. "This is my preliminary finding. Contractor performance exceeds all requirements. No violations found. Several commendable practices documented for potential adoption across other facilities. Do you agree with this assessment?" Nina read the report carefully. "Yes, ma'am, that's accurate." Chen hit save, then turned to Harris. "Commander, I'll be sending my full report to your supervisor and to NAVFAC. Given the quality of Miss Cade's work and the discrepancies she's documented that appear to have been ignored, I'm recommending a broader audit of supply chain management at this facility. We may have systemic issues that need addressing." Harris's face went carefully neutral, but his jaw tightened. "Of course, whatever the Navy needs, we're always happy to cooperate with oversight." Chen packed up her laptop. "Miss Cade, thank you for your cooperation. Keep up the good work." She nodded to Harris and Vance, then left. The office fell silent. Harris stared at Nina. Nina looked back, her expression still empty, still unreadable. Finally, Harris spoke, his voice low and controlled. "You think you're clever. You think documentation protects you. But you're still just a contractor, and contractors are replaceable." He walked out. Vance followed, pausing long enough to give Nina a look that promised consequences later. Nina waited until they were gone, then exhaled slowly and allowed herself one moment of private satisfaction. Round one had gone to her, but she knew Harris wouldn't stop. If anything, she'd just made him more dangerous. Her phone buzzed. Text from Kellerman. "Nice work, but watch yourself." Harris looked ready to explode. She typed back, "Thanks for the heads up." Then she deleted the exchange, pocketed the phone, and went to start prep for lunch service. Because whatever was coming next, she'd face it the same way she faced everything, quietly, carefully, and with the kind of patience that turned prey into predators when the moment was right. At 11:45 a.m., the lunch rush was building when the executive officer of the facility, Commander Sarah Brennan, walked into the DFE with purpose. She found Nina behind the serving line and gestured for her to step aside. Nina followed her to the office, where Brennan closed the door and pulled out a tablet. "Miss Cade, I need to show you something." The tablet displayed a screenshot from the facility's internal message board, a forum where personnel could post announcements and have informal discussions. Someone had created a thread titled Contractor Food Safety Concerns, with Nina's full name attached. The post detailed numerous alleged violations: improper food storage, failure to maintain temperature logs, unprofessional conduct, including inappropriate relationships with military personnel. Every single allegation was false, but they were specific enough to sound plausible and mix just enough truth, like the mention of temperature logs, to seem credible. "This was posted 2 hours ago," Brennan said. "It's been viewed by over 300 people. I've had 5 formal complaints filed based on this post alone. What do you have to say about these allegations?" Nina read through the post carefully. "They're fabricated, ma'am. I can provide documentation refuting every point. I just completed an audit this morning that found no violations." Brennan nodded. "I'm aware of Chen's report, but perception matters, Miss Cade. Even if these allegations are false, they create a hostile environment, and I have to consider whether keeping you on assignment is worth the disruption." Translation: "You might be innocent, but you're still a problem I'd rather not deal with." Nina had been expecting this. Public humiliation, failed audit, social media attack, classic pattern for isolating a target. She kept her voice level. "Ma'am, I understand your position, but removing me because of false allegations would reward the people making them, and it would send a message that anyone can be removed through rumor and innuendo." "That's a valid point," Brennan conceded, "but I need to maintain order in this facility. I'm giving you 72 hours to resolve this situation. Prove the allegations are false, identify who posted them if you can, and restore your professional reputation. If you can't do that, I'll have to terminate your contract. Not as punishment, but as practical necessity." 72 hours. Nina had been given 60 by her contact. Now she had 72 to both solve the investigation and save her cover. The timelines were colliding. "Understood, ma'am. I'll have answers within that time frame." Brennan stood. "I hope you do. For what it's worth, Chen's report was impressive. I'd hate to lose someone with your attention to detail over false allegations." She left. Nina sat in the empty office, recalculating. Harris had escalated faster than expected, which meant he was either more worried or more confident than she'd estimated. Probably both. Worried about Chen's audit, confident that social pressure would accomplish what official channels couldn't. She had 72 hours. She needed to use them wisely. First priority, trace the post. Second, identify the distribution network for stolen goods. Third, find the higher-up protecting Harris. Fourth, do all of this while maintaining her cover and surviving whatever Harris had planned next. Her phone buzzed again. Unknown number, parking lot, 2 minutes, come alone. Nina considered ignoring it, decided curiosity was worth the risk. She walked out through the loading dock, across the service road, and into the contractor parking lot where her car sat in the third row. A dark sedan with tinted windows idled 3 spaces away. The rear window rolled down. "Get in," said a voice she recognized. Her contact, the man who'd authorized escalation yesterday. Nina got in. The driver pulled out immediately, circling through base roads without leaving the facility. The man in the back seat with her was 60, gray hair cut military short, wearing civilian clothes that somehow looked like a uniform anyway. She knew him as Mr. Dalton, though she doubted that was his real name. 72 hours is too long, he said without preamble. Someone in Harris's network is getting nervous. We've detected encrypted communications between this base and 2 others. Whatever they're moving, they're accelerating the timeline. Then we accelerate too, Nina said. I'm close. I have documentation, testimony from an ally, and Chen's audit creating pressure. If I push Harris hard enough, he'll reach for his protection and expose the whole network. Or he'll eliminate the threat, which is you. I can handle Harris. Dalton looked at her with the steady gaze of someone who had sent people into danger many times and knew exactly what that cost. I know you can, but handling Harris isn't the mission. The mission is dismantling the network. Don't lose sight of that. The car stopped. They'd circled back to the contractor lot. 48 hours, Nina. After that, we pull you out and go with what we have, even if it means losing the big fish. She got out. The sedan drove away. Nina walked back to her car, sat in the driver's seat, and stared at the DFAC in the distance. 48 hours. 72 hours. Whatever the number, the endgame was accelerating. She just hoped she was ready for what came next. At 1:30 p.m., Nina returned to her duties. The lunch shift was winding down. Kellerman caught her eye and tilted his head toward the loading dock. 5 minutes later, they stood behind a dumpster where security cameras couldn't reach. Harris met with 3 people in his office 20 minutes ago, Kellerman said quietly. Vance, Drummond, and someone I didn't recognize. Civilian, expensive suit. Left in a black Audi. I got a partial plate. He showed Nina a photo on his phone. Grainy, but clear enough to read the license plate. She memorized the number. What did you hear? Not much, but they sounded worried. And the civilian kept saying something about containing the exposure. Then he left. 10 minutes later, you got called to see Brennan. The pattern was clear. Audit fails to remove Nina, so they shift to social pressure. That fails to force immediate termination, so they buy time with the 72-hour window while scrambling to contain whatever exposure Nina represented. I need you to do something dangerous, Nina said. Kellerman nodded. I figured. What do you need? Tonight, after closing, I need access to Harris's office. I need 20 minutes uninterrupted. Security cameras will catch you. Let me worry about that. I just need you to make sure nobody walks in. Kellerman considered it, then nodded. There's a rotation change at 2200. Third shift starts, second shift leaves. 30-minute window where people are focused on handoff, not patrol. I can get you in, stand watch, and get you out. But if we're caught, I can't protect you. I'm not asking you to. Just get me in. They separated, returning to their duties through different paths. The rest of the shift passed in careful normalcy. Nina served food, cleaned stations, and gave no indication anything had changed. But behind the routine, she was planning. 20 minutes in Harris's office. What could she find? Financial records linking to the distribution network, communications with the higher-up, evidence of the stolen goods destination, something concrete enough to justify federal intervention. At 9:45 p.m., she drove off base like normal. At 10:15 p.m., she returned on foot through a maintenance gate she'd mapped during her first week. Using an access code she'd copied from a maintenance worker's clipboard, She made her way through shadows to the DFAC, where Kellerman let her in through the loading dock at exactly 10:02 p.m. 20 minutes, he said, starting now. Nina moved through the dark facility with the confidence of someone who had memorized the layout. Harris's office was on the second floor, accessible via a stairwell that bypassed most camera angles. She picked the lock in 18 seconds, entered, and closed the door behind her. The office was exactly what she expected. Military neat, professionally decorated, ego wall with commendations and photos of Harris with important-looking people. She photographed the ego wall first, then moved to the desk. Locked drawers. She picked those too. Inside, routine correspondence, performance reviews, facility reports. Nothing incriminating on the surface. But Nina hadn't expected Harris to be stupid enough to leave evidence in plain sight. She pulled out a USB drive, plugged it into his computer, and ran a program that bypassed the login screen and copied his hard drive contents. While that ran, she checked the filing cabinets. Standard supplies, personnel files, budget documents. Again, nothing obvious. But hidden in a hanging folder marked Maintenance Requests Historical was a handwritten ledger. Nina photographed every page. The ledger showed transactions, dates, quantities, dollar amounts, and initials. The pattern was clear once you knew what to look for. Inventory went missing from base. Sales appeared in the ledger. Money flowed to accounts identified only by initials. BH, LV, RD, Blake Harris, Lance Vance, Robert Drummond, and one more set of initials appeared regularly in the high-value transactions. MW. Nina didn't know who MW was yet, but she knew they were important. The USB finished copying. She pulled it out, locked everything back the way she'd found it, and exited the office. Total time, 17 minutes. Kellerman met her at the stairwell. "Clear, let's go." They made it back to the loading dock. Nina slipped out the same way she'd entered. By 11:05 p.m., she was back in her apartment, uploading the hard drive contents and ledger photos to her encrypted server. The investigation was no longer theoretical. She had evidence. Not enough yet for prosecution, but enough to prove the pattern and justify the next phase. She drafted a report, sent it to Dalton's secure channel, and fell into bed at 1:30 a.m. 4 hours later, her alarm went off. Time to go back to base. Time to play contractor. Time to let Harris think he was still winning while the net pulled tighter around him. But as she dressed in the dark apartment, checking her bandaged wrist and making sure the tattoo stayed hidden, Nina felt the familiar weight of an operation approaching critical mass. The next 48 hours would determine whether she had accomplished the mission or simply become another casualty of trying. She thought of Yemen, 9 people dead because someone ran a supply fraud that swapped good equipment for cheap garbage, body armor that failed, radios that cut out at critical moments, medical supplies that were expired or counterfeit. Her husband, team leader of Task Force Blackbird, killed by a vest that should have stopped the round but didn't because someone had made a profit by cutting corners. Nina looked at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. Same neutral expression, same quiet contractor, but underneath, a patient predator waiting for the moment when patience became action. Today was day 22 of her assignment. If everything went right, it would also be the day Harris made the mistake she'd been waiting for. She just had to survive long enough to exploit it. The morning of day 23 started with rain. Not the gentle kind that whispered against windows, but the aggressive Atlantic storm variety that turned parking lots into obstacle courses and made everyone who stepped outside immediately regret it. Nina arrived at the DFAC at 5:52 a.m., hair plastered to her skull, despite the hood she'd worn from the car, and found Kellerman already in the kitchen, looking grim. "We've got a problem," he said quietly, gesturing toward the office. "XO wants to see you, again, and Harris is in there with her." Nina's expression didn't change, but her mind accelerated through possibilities. 24 hours since Brennan's 72-hour deadline, 48 hours left on her investigation timeline. Something had shifted overnight. She walked to the office, knocked once, and entered when Brennan's voice called permission. The executive officer sat behind the desk. Harris stood to one side with his arms crossed, and a third person Nina didn't recognize occupied the remaining chair. Male, mid-40s, suit that cost more than most sailors made in a month, briefcase resting against his leg like a weapon. "Miss Cade," Brennan began, her tone carefully neutral. "This is Mr. Walsh from Contract Oversight. He's here to discuss some concerns that have been raised about your performance. Walsh didn't stand or offer to shake hands. He just opened his briefcase and pulled out a tablet. Ms. Cade, we've received multiple reports suggesting you've been accessing areas beyond your authorized scope. Storage rooms after hours, office spaces, even security camera systems. He turned the tablet toward her. Can you explain these access logs? The screen showed a spreadsheet of entry records. Nina's badge number appeared repeatedly in locations she'd legitimately accessed as part of her food safety duties. But mixed in were 3 entries she hadn't made. Harris's office at 10:30 p.m. 3 days ago, the secure storage area at midnight last week, and the security office at 2 a.m. yesterday. All fabricated, all plausible enough to create reasonable doubt. Those entries are false, Nina said calmly. I've never accessed those locations at those times. Someone cloned my badge or falsified the records. Walsh smiled without warmth. That's a serious accusation. Do you have proof? Do you have proof they're accurate? Access logs can be manipulated. I'd like to see the corresponding security footage for those times. Harris finally spoke, his voice reasonable and concerned in a way that made Nina's skin crawl. Unfortunately, we've had some technical difficulties with our camera system. Several recordings from the past week are corrupted or missing. It's very concerning from a security standpoint. The trap was elegant. Create false access logs, corrupt the footage that would disprove them, then use the absence of evidence as evidence itself. Nina had to admit a certain professional respect for the execution, even as she calculated how to dismantle it. Ma'am, Nina addressed Brennan directly, I can provide my personal calendar, cell phone location data, and witnesses who can verify my whereabouts during those times. I'm also willing to submit to any investigation necessary to prove these logs are falsified. Brennan looked uncomfortable. That may not be sufficient. Mr. Walsh has authority to terminate contracts based on security concerns. Given the pattern of allegations and now these access violations, legitimate or not, I'm not sure I can justify keeping you on assignment. With respect, ma'am, that's exactly what whoever fabricated these records wants. They want me gone before I can finish documenting the supply chain discrepancies I've been reporting. Walsh closed his tablet with a decisive click. Those alleged discrepancies have been investigated by Commander Harris's team. They found no evidence of systematic problems, just normal inventory variance and your unfamiliarity with military supply procedures. Then why did Patricia Chen's audit commend my documentation and recommend a broader facility investigation? The question hung in the air. Walsh's smile tightened. Ms. Chen's report noted exemplary individual performance. It didn't validate your allegations about broader problems. A careful distinction, true enough to be defensible, misleading enough to protect Harris. Nina recognized the technique. Walsh wasn't just contract oversight. He was the higher-up Kellerman had mentioned, the one running interference. The initials from the ledger suddenly made sense. MWW, Marcus Walsh. Nina had just met the top of the pyramid. I need to make a phone call, she said. Contract disputes require notification of my employer within 2 hours of termination proceedings. That's standard in my agreement. Brennan nodded. You have 15 minutes. Use the phone in the break room. We'll finalize this when you return. Nina left the office, walked past Kellerman, who was pretending to inventory dry goods, and stepped into the break room. She pulled out her personal phone and called Dalton's number. He answered on the first ring. They're moving to terminate, she said without preamble. And I just met MWW, Marcus Walsh, contract oversight. He's the protection. Can you prove it? The ledger from Harris's office shows MW initials on high-value transactions. Walsh just tried to terminate me using falsified access logs. He's protecting Harris, which means he's part of the network. Dalton was silent for 3 seconds. Do you have enough for prosecution? Not yet. I need the distribution endpoint, where the stolen goods are going, and I need it in the next few hours, or I lose access to the base internal. What do you need? Authority override. Someone who outranks Walsh and can pause the termination long enough for me to close this. I'll make calls, stall for 2 hours. The line went dead. Nina pocketed her phone, waited exactly 14 minutes, then returned to the office. Walsh looked annoyed at her timing. Brennan looked tired. Harris looked confident. I've notified my employer, Nina said. They're reviewing the contract terms and will respond within 2 hours. Until then, contractually, I remain on duty. Walsh stood. That's not how this works. Security concerns override contract procedures. Then you'll need to involve base security to remove me, which means filing an incident report, which becomes part of the official record. Are you prepared to justify that documentation? The threat was subtle but clear. Force her removal, create a paper trail, expose the process to scrutiny. Walsh and Harris exchanged a look. They could push it, but pushing created risk. Better to wait 2 hours and terminate her cleanly with documentation that looked legitimate. Fine, Walsh said. 2 hours. But you're confined to the kitchen under supervision. Any attempt to access unauthorized areas results in immediate removal and potential criminal charges. Understood. Nina returned to the kitchen where Kellerman was waiting. She walked past him to the dry storage room, and he followed 30 seconds later, closing the door behind them. I heard most of that through the wall, he said. Walsh is dirty. Top of the chain. Harris and his crew are middle management. Walsh is the one making this profitable enough to risk. Can you prove it in 2 hours? I need help. The backup cameras you uploaded yesterday. Can you send them to base security anonymously? Include the footage showing Vance and Drummond moving inventory after hours? Kellerman nodded. I can route it through a proxy email. Make it look like it came from outside. What else? I need to get into the secure storage area. The real one, not the regular warehouse, where they'd hide high-value goods waiting for distribution. That's locked with a code that changes weekly. Only Harris, Vance, and the base security chief have access. Who's the security chief? Colonel Wexler. He's a career security forces, straight arrow, doesn't tolerate corruption. But he's also by the book. You'd need hard evidence before he'd act. Nina considered the angles. Wexler was the wild card. If he was clean, he was an asset. If he was compromised, approaching him would warn the network. But time was running out, and she needed someone with authority to override Walsh. Send Wexler the camera footage. Include a note saying there is more evidence in the secure storage area and asking him to conduct a surprise inspection. Make it sound like it's coming from a concerned sailor who wants to remain anonymous. That's risky. If Wexler tells Harris, you're finished. If I don't close this case in 2 hours, I'm finished anyway. At least this way we force the play. Kellerman pulled out his phone and started crafting the message. Nina returned to the main kitchen and began prep work for breakfast service, maintaining the appearance of normal routine while the clock ticked down her remaining time. At 7:48 a.m., Harris appeared in the kitchen doorway. He walked directly to Nina, stopping close enough to invade her personal space, and spoke quietly so only she could hear. I don't know who you really are, but I know you're not just a contractor. You're too good, too careful, too persistent. That makes you dangerous. He smiled. But in 90 minutes, you'll be gone. And whatever you think you found will disappear with you, because that's how this works. The system protects people like me. Nina met his eyes. Does it protect people like Walsh? Harris's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Confirmation. He knew Walsh was exposed, which meant Walsh had told him Nina had made the connection, which meant they were both worried. Good. Harris recovered quickly. I don't know what you're talking about, but I hope whatever happens next, you land on your feet. It would be a shame if your career ended over false allegations. He walked away. Nina's hand stayed steady as she continued chopping vegetables for the breakfast buffet. The knife moved in precise, economical cuts that spoke of someone who'd handled blades in contexts far removed from food preparation. Kellerman noticed. Harris didn't. At 8:26 a.m., Colonel Wexler entered the DFIC with 2 security personnel. He spoke briefly with Brennan, then approached Harris, who'd been watching the breakfast service from the beverage station. Nina couldn't hear their conversation, but she watched Harris's body language shift from confident to defensive. Wexler showed him something on a tablet. Harris shook his head, gestured dismissively, started to walk away. Wexler's voice cut through the ambient noise. Commander Harris, you will accompany me to the secure storage area. Now. That's an order, not a request. The dining facility went quiet. Conversations stopped mid-sentence. Everyone sensed the sudden shift in power dynamics. Harris stood frozen for 3 seconds, calculating options, then nodded and followed Wexler toward the exit. As they passed the serving line, Wexler paused and looked directly at Nina. Miss Cade, you should come with us. I have questions about inventory procedures. Nina set down her serving spoon, wiped her hands on her apron, and followed. Kellerman gave her a microscopic nod. The email had worked. Wexler had taken the bait. Now came the critical moment where everything either came together or collapsed completely. They walked through the SIS facility, down a service corridor, past the regular warehouse to a reinforced door with a keypad lock. Wexler entered the code. The door opened onto a space roughly 30 feet by 40, lined with industrial shelving holding boxes marked with military supply codes. Wexler gestured to his security personnel. "Document everything. Photos, inventory counts, serial numbers. I want a complete record." Harris tried once more. "Colonel, I don't know what you think you're investigating, but this is standard overflow storage. Everything here is properly accounted for." "Then you won't mind if we verify that." Wexler walked to the nearest shelf and pulled down a box marked Office Supplies, Paper Products. He opened it, revealing bottles of premium olive oil. He held one up, checking the label. "This is the same brand Miss Cade reported as missing from regular inventory. Same lot number." "There must be a labeling error," Harris said quickly. "Someone misfiled it." Wexler opened 3 more boxes. Premium beef, imported cheese, high-end coffee, all items Nina had documented as missing, all stored in boxes labeled as something completely different. "That's a lot of labeling errors, Commander." Harris's face had gone pale. "I want to speak to my attorney, and I want Mr. Walsh from Contract Oversight here immediately." "Mr. Walsh is currently being interviewed by NCIS agents at the base headquarters," Wexler said calmly. "Based on financial records that were anonymously delivered to my office this morning, records showing transactions that match the inventory discrepancies Miss Cade has been documenting." Nina kept her expression neutral, but inside she felt the familiar rush of an operation reaching culmination. Kellerman had sent more than just camera footage. He'd sent the photos of Harris's ledger. The evidence was cascading exactly as it needed to. Harris made his mistake then. Instead of staying quiet, instead of waiting for an attorney, he turned on Nina with sudden fury. "This is your fault. You came here pretending to be nobody, but you've been investigating us from the start. Who are you really?" He grabbed her shoulder, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. Nina's training took over in the space between heartbeats. Her right hand came up, caught his wrist, rotated it outward in a smooth arc that broke his grip and locked his arm at an angle that sent immediate pain signals to his brain. She held the position for exactly 2 seconds, long enough to neutralize the threat, not long enough to cause injury. Harris dropped to one knee. The motion pulled his collar aside and Nina's sleeve up, exposing her forearm. Exposing the tattoo. The movement froze. Everyone in the room stared at Nina's wrist, where black ink formed the shape of a bird in flight. Wings spread, rendered in the sharp geometric style of military unit insignia. No elaborate details, no decorative elements, just clean lines that told a specific story to people who knew how to read it. And beneath the bird, small but clear, TB-19N. Kellerman, who'd followed them and stood in the doorway, breathed one word. "That's Task Force Blackbird." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Wexler straightened, his eyes going from the tattoo to Nina's face and back again. Blackbird was disbanded 8 years ago, after Yemen. Harris, still kneeling, looked between Nina and Wexler with growing horror. "What is Blackbird?" Wexler ignored him. "Miss Cade, I'm going to need you to explain that tattoo, right now." Nina released Harris's wrist, letting him scramble backward. She rolled her sleeve up completely, revealing the full design. Task Force Blackbird, Counterintelligence and Internal Affairs, specialized in investigating military supply chain corruption. She looked directly at Wexler. "We disbanded after 9 members died in Yemen because someone ran a supply fraud, swapped regulation gear for cheap garbage, body armor that failed, radios that cut out, medical supplies that were expired or counterfeit." She pulled out her phone, opened a folder, and displayed it so Wexler could see. Photos of bodies under sheets, official investigation reports, and one photo showing a younger Nina in combat gear, standing with 8 other soldiers, all wearing the same Blackbird patch. "My husband led that team," she continued, her voice flat and controlled. "He died wearing a vest that should have stopped a rifle round, but didn't because someone made a profit cutting corners. We traced the fraud back to 3 military bases running the same scheme. We shut down 2. The 3rd buried us before we could finish. 9 people died. The unit was disbanded. The investigation was classified and sealed." Wexler studied the photos. "If Blackbird was disbanded, what are you doing here?" "The fraud pattern never stopped. It just went quieter. 6 months ago, my contacts flagged Norfolk for the same statistical anomalies we'd seen before. Missing high-value inventory. suspicious vendor relationships, supply chain discrepancies that looked like variants but weren't. So I came back. Different name, different cover, same mission. She gestured at the room full of mislabeled boxes. Find the network, document the fraud, stop it before more people die from equipment that fails when it's needed most. Harris tried to stand. Wexler's security personnel moved to flank him, hands resting casually on their duty belts. Stay where you are, Commander. This is entrapment, Harris said desperately. She infiltrated under false pretenses. Nothing she found is admissible. Nina pulled out a second phone, official-looking, and scrolled through screens. I'm a GS-13 criminal investigator with the Defense Logistics Agency, operating under federal authority to investigate procurement fraud. My contractor cover was approved by the Department of Defense Inspector General. Every piece of evidence I've gathered is admissible and will be used. She looked at Wexler, including the financial records showing Commander Harris, Lieutenant Vance, Petty Officer Drummond, and Marcus Walsh have been running a supply diversion scheme for at least 18 months. Wexler pulled out his radio. This is Colonel Wexler. I need NCIS at my location immediately. Multiple suspects in custody for procurement fraud. Alert Base Command, we have a federal investigation in progress. The radio crackled acknowledgement. Wexler looked at Nina. I'm going to need all your documentation. Everything you've collected. It's already been transmitted to federal prosecutors, but I can provide copies. Nina turned to face Harris, who sat slumped against a storage shelf. You didn't humiliate a contractor, Commander. You exposed a federal case. Every time you pushed me, you made mistakes. The false social media posts, the fabricated access logs. The audit that proved my documentation was better than yours. You thought you were hunting me, but I was patient, and patience always wins. Why didn't you just identify yourself from the start? Wexler asked. Nina's expression shifted, showing emotion for the first time. Grief, anger, cold determination. Because if I'd walked in with credentials, they would have buried the evidence. Everyone involved would have gotten away clean, and the network would have just moved somewhere else. But by staying invisible, by letting them think I was weak, I got them to relax and expose themselves publicly. She gestured at the room. This is just one base. Walsh's financial records show connections to San Diego and Pearl Harbor. This is a network moving millions of dollars in military goods. And now we have everything we need to dismantle it. Do you believe in quiet justice? If you think patience beats power, share this video and stick around because Nina's war isn't over yet. The NCIS agents arrived 12 minutes later. Harris, Vance, and Drummond were taken into custody and escorted off base. Walsh had already been arrested at headquarters. The secure storage area was sealed as a crime scene. At 10:47 a.m., Nina sat in Commander Brennan's office, providing a formal statement. Wexler stood to one side. I owe you an apology, Brennan said quietly. I almost let them push you out. You were doing your job with incomplete information, Nina replied. That's what they counted on. Wexler cleared his throat. Miss Cade, I'm going to recommend you for a civilian commendation. What you did here, the patience and professionalism under sustained harassment, that deserves recognition. I'd prefer no public recognition, Colonel. Blackbird worked best in silence. He nodded. Then would you consider staying on to oversee the supply chain audit? That's months of work. Nina shook her head. My work here is done, but I can recommend investigators from DLA who specialize in this. At 1:15 p.m., Nina returned to the DFSC one last time. Kellerman found her collecting her personal items from the desk drawer. You're really leaving? He asked. The case is closed. Time to move on. When I saw you breathing in counts of 4 that first day, I knew you were someone. I just didn't realize how much someone. He paused. For what it's worth, it was an honor serving with you again. Nina smiled, small and genuine. I wasn't pretending to care about food safety, or about doing the job right. That part was real. The rest was just camouflage. They shook hands. Nina finished packing and drove off base at 2:33 p.m. But before she left Norfolk completely, she had one more stop. The Navy Marine Corps' Relief Society office sat just outside the base gates. Nina walked in and handed over an envelope containing a cashier's check for $50,000. This is an anonymous donation, she told the startled volunteer, specifically designated for families of service members killed in Yemen between 2016 and 2019. Please make sure it gets to them. She left before anyone could ask questions. The money had come from her own savings, accumulated over years of living minimally. Her husband wouldn't have wanted her to spend her life mourning, but he would have wanted the families taken care of. Nina drove back to her apartment, packed everything she owned into 2 duffel bags and a backpack, then wiped the space clean. By 8 p.m., she was on Interstate 95, heading south. Her phone rang at 9:22 p.m. Dalton. Norfolk investigation is officially closed, he said. NCIS has 4 suspects in custody, financial evidence of fraud totaling $4.2 million, and connections to 2 other bases. Federal prosecutors are calling it the largest military procurement fraud case in a decade. What about the other bases, San Diego and Pearl Harbor? That's why I'm calling. Same pattern, different commodities. San Diego is weapons parts. Pearl Harbor is electronics, both potentially catastrophic if the gear fails in combat. Nina had expected this. You want me to do it again? I'm asking if you're willing. She drove in silence for 30 seconds, watching highway lights blur past, thinking about 9 people buried because of fraud, thinking about how many more would die if the network wasn't stopped. San Diego first, she said finally, but I'll need a different cover. Contractor won't work twice. Already working on it. I'll have details in 48 hours. In the meantime, rest. This kind of work extracts a price. He ended the call. Nina drove another hour, then pulled into a rest stop and finally let herself relax. The adrenaline drained away, leaving exhaustion in its wake. Her phone buzzed one more time. Text from an unknown number. San Diego isn't food, it's weapons. Careful. Nina read the message 3 times, analyzing the warning, the fact that someone outside her chain of command knew about San Diego before she'd officially accepted. Either she had an ally she didn't know about, or she had a leak, or the network had figured out she wasn't done. All 3 possibilities were dangerous. She deleted the message, started the car, and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched ahead into darkness. Nina had no home to return to, no family waiting, no life outside the mission. Just a tattoo she kept hidden, a phone number that connected to Dalton, and a skill set built for patient hunting. Justice wasn't loud. It didn't announce itself with fanfare or demand immediate satisfaction. Justice was the long count, the careful accumulation of evidence, the moment when all the patience crystallized into action that couldn't be denied or buried or explained away. Commander Harris had learned that today. San Diego would learn it soon. Nina drove through the night, and somewhere around midnight, passing through the Carolina darkness with the window cracked and cold air streaming in, she allowed herself one small smile. Not triumph, not satisfaction, just the quiet acknowledgement that she'd done what she came to do, and she'd do it again. And she'd keep doing it until the network was broken or she was. The mission continued, the hunt never stopped, and Nina Cade, whatever name she wore next, would be ready. Justice isn't a surprise inspection, it's a long count.